The crystalline throne room of the Altari Empire stretched before Captain David Kane like a cathedral built from captured starlight. Walls of living crystal pulsed with soft bioluminescence, their surfaces reflecting and amplifying the natural radiance that seemed to emanate from every Altari present. At the chamber's heart, Queen Zaratil sat upon a throne carved from a single massive gemstone, her ethereal beauty made even more striking by the pointed ears and luminous skin that marked her as distinctly non-human. David stood in the defendant's circle, his hands bound with energy restraints that hummed with barely contained power. The formal charges echoed through the vast space as the court herald's voice carried the weight of ancient law and imperial tradition. Captain David Kane of the Terran Confederation, the herald announced, you stand accused of unauthorized incursion into sovereign Altari space, violation of the territorial accords of 2387, and potential acts of espionage against the imperial crown. The assembled nobility watched from tiered galleries that rose like amphitheater seating around the throne room's perimeter. Lords and ladies in flowing robes that seemed woven from captured moonlight whispered among themselves in the musical Altari language, their pointed ears twitching with expressions David couldn't interpret. How do you answer these charges? Queen Zaratil asked, her voice carrying easily through the chamber despite its vast dimensions. David straightened to attention, his military bearing undiminished by his circumstances. Your Majesty, I acknowledge crossing into Altari space without authorization. However, I contest the charge of espionage and request the opportunity to explain the circumstances that led to my actions. The Queen's luminous eyes studied his face with an intensity that made David feel exposed and analyzed. Explain. My ship, the Pathfinder, was investigating reports of missing vessels in the neutral zone. What we discovered was evidence of raiders using stolen Altari technology to attack ships from both our species. A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the assembled court. Several nobles leaned forward with obvious interest, while others exchanged skeptical glances that suggested they viewed David's claims as desperate attempts to avoid punishment. These are serious allegations, Queen Zaratil said, her expression unreadable. Do you have evidence to support these claims? Yes, Your Majesty. Sensor logs, wreckage analysis, and intercepted communications. The raiders have been using your territorial boundaries as protection, knowing that pursuing vessels couldn't follow them into Altari space without triggering diplomatic incidents. The Queen gestured to her advisors, who immediately began consulting data tablets and speaking in urgent whispers. David watched the byplay with growing hope. If they were willing to examine his evidence, he might have a chance to prove his good intentions. Captain Kane, the Queen said after several minutes of consultation, these are complex accusations that require careful investigation. The court will examine your evidence, but the fact remains that you violated our territorial sovereignty. I understand, Your Majesty. I accept responsibility for my actions. But I believed your people needed to know about the security breach in your territory. The throne room fell silent as the implications of his statement registered. David had essentially admitted to risking his life to warn a potentially hostile alien government about threats to their security, behavior that suggested either remarkable stupidity or genuine honor. You crossed into Altari space, Queen Zaratil said slowly, knowing it could mean your death, in order to warn us about threats we weren't aware of. Yes, Your Majesty. The Queen leaned back in her crystal throne, her expression thoughtful. Around the chamber, the assembled nobility watched this unprecedented exchange with fascination and growing respect for the human who stood unbroken before their queen. Captain Kane, I find myself curious about your motivations. Tell me, what did you hope to accomplish by risking your life for the benefit of strangers? David considered the question carefully, aware that his answer might determine not just his fate but the future relationship between their species. Your Majesty, I believe that threats to any civilization's security are threats to galactic stability. Today it's raiders in the neutral zone. Tomorrow it could be something worse. We're neighbors in this galaxy whether we like it or not. Sometimes neighbors need to warn each other about dangers, even when they're not friends. The Queen's smile was slight but genuine, transforming her entire expression in a way that made David's breath catch. An interesting philosophy, Captain. We shall see if your evidence supports your noble intentions. The examination of David's evidence took place in a smaller chamber adjacent to the main throne room, where holographic displays could project his ship's sensor data for detailed analysis. Queen Zaratiel presided over the review personally, her questions demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of both military tactics and spacefaring technology that impressed even David's tactical training. These energy signatures, the Queen said, studying the holographic wreckage patterns floating before them, they match stolen Altari weapon systems reported missing 6 months ago. How did you identify them as our technology? David moved to the display, his restraints having been removed to allow him to operate the controls. The harmonic frequencies are distinctive, Your Majesty. Each species' energy weapons leave unique residual patterns. Your technology uses quantum resonance cascades that create signature traces. You have studied Altari military technology extensively. Only what's available through diplomatic exchanges and technical journals. Understanding your capabilities helps us avoid accidental conflicts. The Queen's pointed ears twitched in what David was beginning to recognize as a gesture of interest or approval. Admirable prudence. Continue your analysis. The holographic displays revealed the scope of the raider operation, attack patterns that had claimed vessels from both human and Altari merchant fleets, always striking in the neutral zone before fleeing into protected space. David's pursuit of the raiders had taken him across the territorial boundary just as they entered Altari space, leaving him exposed when their patrol ships arrived. Your tactical assessment proved accurate, Queen Zaratiel admitted after reviewing the complete evidence. These raiders have been using our territorial laws as protection while attacking our shipping. We owe you gratitude, not punishment. Your Majesty is generous, but I still violated your sovereignty. I understand if there must be consequences. The Queen studied his face with renewed interest. You accept responsibility even when offered exemption? Curious. Tell me, Captain, what drives this sense of honor? David found himself relaxing as their conversation shifted from formal interrogation to something approaching genuine discussion. Military service teaches you that actions have consequences, Your Majesty. Good intentions don't excuse poor judgment. I made the choice to cross your border, so I accept whatever follows. And if that consequence is death, then I die knowing I tried to do the right thing. There are worse ways to end a life. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, her luminous eyes studying David's expression as if searching for deception or hidden motives. You speak of death with remarkable equanimity for someone so young. Not young, Your Majesty. Just experienced enough to know that some things matter more than survival. Their discussions continued over several days as the Queen's investigators verified David's evidence and tracked down the raider network he'd exposed. During these sessions, their conversations ranged beyond military matters to philosophy, leadership, and the challenges of command. Do you ever find the isolation difficult? Queen Zaratiel asked during one of their private sessions, away from the formal court proceedings. Isolation, Your Majesty. Command decisions that affect thousands of lives. The inability to show uncertainty or fear to those who depend on your strength. The knowledge that your choices will be judged by history long after you're gone. David recognized the weight in her voice, the same burden he carried as a military commander, magnified by the scope of imperial responsibility. Every day. But isolation is the price of authority. People need leaders who appear certain, even when we're not. Indeed. And personal relationships become complicated when duty must always come first. There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience rather than theoretical discussion. David ventured a careful response. It's difficult to maintain connections with people who can't understand the weight of command decisions. And unfair to ask them to accept always being secondary to duty. Precisely. Altari tradition requires that I marry within the noble houses to maintain political alliances. But these partnerships focus on bloodlines and political advantage rather than personal compatibility. David felt they were venturing into dangerous territory, but her openness invited honesty in return. Sounds lonely. Profoundly so. To be surrounded by thousands of subjects and advisors, yet unable to have a single conversation where someone sees you as a person rather than a symbol. Their eyes met across the chamber, and David realized that despite the vast differences in their species and circumstances, they shared a fundamental understanding of leadership's burden, and its isolation. The political ramifications of David's evidence created fractures within the Altari noble houses that became increasingly visible as the investigation progressed. Lord Vailith, representing the traditionalist faction, argued for strict enforcement of territorial law regardless of David's motivations, while Lady Saren led progressive nobles who recognized the changing realities of galactic politics. The humans' intentions are irrelevant, Lord Vailith declared during a formal court session David was permitted to observe. Altari law exists to protect our sovereignty. Exceptions create precedents that weaken our authority. But his actions prevented greater violations, Lady Saren countered. The raiders would have continued using our territory as a shield for their attacks. Captain Kane's warning allowed us to eliminate a threat we didn't know existed. Queen Zaratil presided over these debates with careful neutrality, but David noticed how her questions consistently pushed both factions to consider broader implications rather than simple adherence to tradition. Lord Vailith, the Queen said during one particularly heated exchange, if we execute Captain Kane for warning us about threats to our security, what message does that send to other species who might discover similar problems? That Altari sovereignty is absolute and inviolable, Your Majesty. Or that we punish those who act in our interests rather than their own. The Queen's private sessions with David had evolved into something that transcended the formal investigation. Their conversations revealed shared experiences that bridged the gap between human and Altari perspective on leadership, duty, and the personal costs of command. My advisors are preparing marriage contracts with 3 different noble houses, Queen Zaratil confided during one of their evening discussions. Each alliance offers strategic advantages for the Empire. But none offers what you actually want, David observed. What I want is irrelevant. Altari queens marry for the good of the Empire, not for personal satisfaction. That seems like a recipe for misery. The Queen's laugh held little humor. Misery is acceptable if it serves the greater good. Personal happiness is a luxury that rulers cannot afford. David found himself increasingly frustrated with the rigid expectations that constrained someone as intelligent and capable as Zaratil. Your Majesty, if I may speak freely. You have been speaking freely for days, Captain. Why stop now? The Empire's strength comes from your wisdom and judgment. But wisdom requires perspective, and judgment requires emotional balance. How can you make the best decisions for your people if you're trapped in a system that denies your own needs? The Queen's luminous eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made David wonder if he'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Are you suggesting that personal fulfillment serves political purposes? I'm suggesting that effective leaders need to be whole people. Isolation and duty are necessary, but they shouldn't be absolute. And what would you propose as an alternative? David realized they were discussing more than theoretical leadership philosophy. Someone who understands the burdens of command. Someone who can share the weight of decisions without compromising your authority. Someone who sees the person behind the crown. Such individuals are rare, Captain. Maybe rarer than they should be. Maybe the problem isn't finding the right person, but creating systems that allow connections to form naturally. Their conversations were interrupted by urgent reports about the raider network David had exposed. The investigation had revealed connections to several minor houses within the Altari nobility, corruption that threatened political stability throughout the Empire. The evidence you provided has exposed traitors within our own government, Queen Zaratil informed him during their final private session before the formal sentencing. House Mordain and House Veleth have been selling military technology to fund their own territorial ambitions. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I didn't intend to create internal political problems. You didn't create them, Captain. You revealed them. There's an important difference. As they prepared for the formal sentencing ceremony, David realized that his fate had become secondary to larger questions about Altari society and its future relationship with other species. The Queen's decision would establish precedents that would affect generations of diplomatic contact. "Whatever you decide tomorrow," David said as their final private meeting concluded, "I want you to know that these conversations have been the most meaningful of my life. You've given me perspectives on leadership that I'll carry with me regardless of how this ends." Queen Zaratiel's smile was radiant and sad simultaneously. "As have you, David Kane. As have you." The formal sentencing ceremony drew representatives from across the Altari Empire, filling the crystalline throne room to capacity as nobles, military officers, and diplomatic observers gathered to witness a decision that would set precedents for generations. David stood once again in the defendant's circle, his military bearing unchanged despite weeks of uncertainty about his fate. Queen Zaratiel entered the chamber wearing the full regalia of imperial authority, robes that seemed woven from captured starlight, a crown of living crystal that amplified her natural luminescence, and the ceremonial sword that symbolized her power over life and death. The assembled crowd fell silent as she took her place upon the ancient throne. "Captain David Kane," the Queen began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space, "you have been found guilty of violating Altari territorial sovereignty. The traditional punishment for such violation is death." The words hung in the air like a blade, and David felt the collective intake of breath from hundreds of witnesses. He maintained his composure, knowing that how he faced his fate would be remembered long after his name was forgotten. However, Queen Zaratiel continued, "Your actions, while technically criminal, were motivated by honor and service to galactic security. Your evidence has exposed corruption within our own nobility and eliminated threats we were unaware of." Lord Valeth shifted uncomfortably in his place among the traditional faction, while Lady Saren leaned forward with obvious interest in the Queen's reasoning. "More importantly," the Queen said, rising from her throne, "your presence here has forced this court to examine not just your actions, but our own assumptions about justice, mercy, and the evolving relationships between species in our shared galaxy." David watched her face as she spoke, seeing not just the formal mask of royal authority but the woman he had come to know through their private conversations, intelligent, isolated, carrying burdens that no one should bear alone. "Captain Kane, in the weeks since your capture, you have demonstrated qualities that are rare in any species: courage without recklessness, honor without rigidity, wisdom without arrogance. You have shown respect for our culture while maintaining your own principles." The Queen paused, her luminous eyes meeting David's gaze directly. Around them, the crystalline walls began to pulse with colors that reflected the emotional resonance building in the chamber. "You have also shown me something I had forgotten was possible: genuine companionship between equals, conversation without political calculation, and the kind of understanding that transcends species barriers." David felt his heart racing as he began to understand where her words were leading. The assembled nobles shifted restlessly, sensing that something unprecedented was about to occur. "Therefore," Queen Zaratiel said, her voice growing stronger and more personal, "I must speak not just as your judge, but as someone whose life you have touched in ways that duty never prepared me for." The throne room fell into absolute silence, every witness holding their breath as their queen abandoned centuries of protocol. "I wish you were my husband, human." The words fell like thunder through the crystalline chamber, echoing off walls that erupted in patterns of light reflecting the shock and amazement of hundreds of witnesses. Nobles gasped audibly, soldiers stood frozen at attention, and even the court officials seemed stunned by their queen's unprecedented declaration. David stared at her in amazement, seeing past the royal regalia to the woman who had just risked her throne to publicly declare feelings that defied every tradition her empire was built upon. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, though his words carried clearly in the hushed chamber, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I am declaring," Queen Zaratiel said with a smile that transformed her entire expression, "that I choose you over political convenience, personal compatibility over bloodline advantages, and love over duty." The implications of her words sent ripples of astonishment through the assembled court. Several traditional nobles looked horrified, while progressive faction members appeared delighted by this dramatic departure from arranged marriage expectations. "And if I accept?" David asked, still hardly believing the reality of the moment. Then you become not just my husband, but my partner in ruling an empire that must learn to navigate new relationships with species like your own. It will not be easy, for either of us. David looked around the throne room, seeing the faces of nobles who would either support or oppose this unprecedented union, understanding that his answer would reshape Altari society and potentially create new models for interspecies cooperation throughout the galaxy. Your Majesty, he said formally, then smiled as he added, Zaratil, yes. Despite the challenges, despite the political complications, despite the fact that 6 months ago I didn't even know your species existed, yes. The crystalline walls erupted in patterns of celebration as the queen stepped down from her throne to take his hands in hers. Around them, the chamber filled with a mixture of cheers, gasps, and urgent whispered conversations as the assembled witnesses processed the most dramatic political and personal declaration in Altari history. Welcome to your new life, David Kane, Queen Zaratil said, her eyes bright with joy and determination. I believe we're going to change the galaxy. As the formal ceremony concluded and preparations began for a wedding that would unite not just 2 individuals but 2 civilizations, David reflected on how his accidental border crossing had led to discoveries he never could have imagined, proving that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single step into unknown territory.